Hello, and welcome to this World Geography online training content video brought to you by the Georgia Department of Education. In this video, we will be addressing Georgia Standards of Excellence SSWG 4C, dealing with various reasons for migration of people across the globe. Let's look at the standard and element we will address in this video. SSWG 4 asks teachers to teach students to assess the characteristics, spatial distribution, and migration of human populations on the Earth's surface. Let's unpack that a little bit. The standard is essentially asking, why do people live where they live, and what factors influence them to move away from or to a different place? Element C asks teachers to teach students to explain how push and pull factors contribute to human migration patterns and evaluate the impact of migration on the use of resources and provision of services, for example, guest workers, refugees, and evacuees. Now let's unpack the element. This is essentially asking, how do push and pull factors lead to migration, and how does that migration impact the use of resources and services? In fact, these questions could be used as essential questions for and within a unit of instruction on this standard and element. It is important for students to understand that people are constantly moving from place to place across the globe. Sometimes the movements are small and insignificant. Other times the movements are large and very significant. It is also vital for students to know that when people move, it is usually because of reasons that pulled or pushed them in a new direction, or some combination of push and pull factors. Lastly, students should recognize that the movement of people can place a stress on available resources and services where the people move to. For this video, we will start by looking in general at push and pull factors. We will then explore some historic examples of significant migrations, making use of migration maps to help us understand the big picture. Lastly, we will investigate how migrations can impact resources and services, specifically focusing on guest workers, refugees, and evacuees. Okay, let's start by looking in general at different push and pull factors. People don't tend to move when things are good. They are either pushed or pulled in a new direction. A push factor is a significant reason a person would leave their home. Some examples of push factors are war, especially civil war, famine, drought, natural disasters, limited economic opportunity, persecution, etc. Often in class, when discussing push factors, students ask why people don't just get up and move. I typically respond that it is easier said than done. How many times have you moved? I sometimes ask. Do you like moving? Students often overlook that moving away from one's home is much more difficult when there are limited resources and opportunities as well. There isn't a moving truck company around the block in every country. Not to mention the next question. Where will they move to? Many times, the push factor must become life-threatening before a move is even considered. And even then, many times, it isn't even an option. Pull factors are just the opposite from push factors, although often the two are in concert with one another. For example, a new job opportunity is generally considered a top pull factor for migrants. However, if that job opportunity was available in the previous location, the person may not have considered a move in the first place. So it was just as much the fact that the job wasn't available in the previous location as it was the fact that it was available in the new location. In this way, pull factors are sometimes linked to push factors. Other pull factors include connecting or reconnecting with family and/or like ethnic groups. When moving to a new place, individuals typically feel more comfortable if they have people they know or are familiar with. So, what happens when there is a significant movement of people from one place to another? One of the classic examples of this in world history is the Bantu Migration. This migration of the Bantu-speaking peoples of West Africa lasted for thousands of years and spread throughout almost all of sub-Saharan Africa. The migration made a wide swath from the Atlantic to the Indian Oceans, heading south. The implications of the migration were equally far-reaching for Africa. Namely, one of the greatest implications of the migration was the cultural influence of the Bantu people, especially language. Today, many of the language groups of sub-Saharan Africa were born out of Bantu language groups, Swahili being one of the most recognized. So, why'd they move? There is some disagreement amongst scholars about the details of the push factor that led to the Bantu migration, but there is consensus that it was because of agricultural opportunities. It always comes back to food, doesn't it? Regardless of the details, the Bantu migration is an example of a voluntary migration. Out of the same continent hundreds of years later, one of the greatest forced migrations occurred, the Atlantic slave trade. This was due to a previously undiscussed push factor, the desire for slave labor. Millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homes in West Africa, loaded on ships, and carried across the sea as if they were product and not people. The impact of the African slave trade is far-reaching, impacting everything from ethnic makeup, cultural diffusion, and race relations throughout the Americas today. While each of these historic examples of migrations help us to understand large-scale migration and resulting cultural change, let's now look more closely at how migration impacts the resources and services of the place of destination. We'll start by examining guest workers. A guest worker is an alien who can work in a country temporarily with permission. Typically, guest workers perform jobs that require little skill or training and fill a need in the workforce, like seasonal agricultural work, for example. Guest workers generally work and live on the terms of the destination country and therefore place low stress on resources and services. The Middle East is infamous for hiring guest workers from Asia to work the oil fields. While the economic stress is low, guest workers sometimes have a very different culture, which can lead to social problems and persecution toward the guest workers. Now let's look at refugees. A refugee is a person who is forced to leave his or her country due to dire threats to their well-being, usually because of an armed conflict. Member nations in the United Nations have agreed it is the duty of other member nations to take in refugees, including providing aid and assistance. Proximity to the source of refugees can lead to an increased strain on resources and services. For example, in the Syrian conflict, the neighboring countries of Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon have carried most of the burden of these refugees. Refugees need shelter, food, water, medical services, and eventually a way to contribute to the country taking them in. Many non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, most of which are based in the US or Europe, typically play a large role in helping relieve some of this stress on resources and services by providing some of it for a time. When there are large numbers of refugees, the local populations of receiving countries can begin to become upset at the strain the refugees are placing on resources and services. This can lead to persecution, racism, and political upheaval, as has happened in some parts of some European countries accepting Syrian refugees. Evacuees are the third specific group of migrating individuals we will discuss. An evacuee is an individual who is in impending and immediate danger, sometimes from a natural disaster. While nations can mostly prepare for refugees and guest workers, evacuees are generally more difficult to prepare for due to the nature of their move. Even with advanced technology, it is still difficult and sometimes impossible to predict natural disasters with much forewarning at all. This makes evacuees very difficult to prepare for and can place an immediate and taxing stress on the resources and services of another nation. Additionally, evacuees likely need assistance to rebuild homes and businesses that have been devastated. Again, this is where NGOs like the Red Cross can and do play a significant role. Although most people groups in the world today are sedentary and no longer nomadic by necessity, people still move. Migrants are pushed and pulled in various directions for a plethora of reasons that sometimes blend the line between push and pull. This movement of people can have significant and lasting impacts on the culture, as we saw in the examples of the Bantu and African slave migrations. The movement of people can also have an important impact on the resources and services of places to which they move, as we saw in the examples of guest workers, refugees, and evacuees. Here are some helpful links for further learning. Thanks for watching.